Radio Angelus, 24-hour online radio.
Welcome once again to Lunchtime Catechesis, an ongoing program that is designed to help us to renew our faith in our Catholic journey as people and believers of Christ. Today we want to look at the sacrament of vocation, having looked at the sacrament of initiation and the sacrament of healing. Today our attention is drawn to the call God has given to each one according to his state of life. And we want to begin with the sacrament of marriage. The sacrament of marriage is embedded in Scripture. Why? Because it is what begins Scripture and ends Scripture. In Genesis chapter 2, already we have the theme of marriage, when God created man and created woman to be his companion. In the same way, when we go to Revelation chapter 19, we see the marriage of the Lamb, which we are presented at the end of time. So we see that marriage is the beginning and the end of Scripture. So to say, someone would say that the whole theme of God's love is captured by the vocation of marriage. But then something happens in Genesis chapter 3. What happens is that there is a break in relationship, and there is a break in the marriage covenant. And since that time, when Eve ate the fruit and gave it to Adam to eat, and they started blaming each other, marriage life was broken. And since Genesis chapter 3 going forward, we realize that there is a constant struggle between a man and a woman, and that has characterized marriage up until now. In fact, when we read Genesis chapter 3, we are told that when God was pronouncing the consequences of sin, he told the woman, you would have desire for your man, for your husband, but your husband would dominate you. What God is revealing is the broken relationship by which men constantly seek to dominate women, even in spite of the fact that women love them. Now, this broken relationship is seen throughout Scripture, and particularly in the Old Testament, because we realize as we go on, concubinage, polygamy, and all sorts of marriages that are not what God intended and was not part of God's plan. So Solomon had so many wives. David had concubines. Abraham, in fact, the father of faith, had another child with Hagar. So all these are symbols of an imperfect marriage and the struggle with sin. But in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus reveals to us that by his coming, he has restored the marriage covenant. And he tells the Pharisees who asked him a question, is divorce permissible? Jesus does not answer the question of divorce, but he refers them back to God's plan. And what is God's plan? That at the beginning, God created the male and female and expected that the male will leave his family and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one. And so he establishes that at the very beginning, God intended that they should be one. And by his coming, he affirms that. And that is why there cannot be divorce in marriage, because God abhors divorce. But we will look at it more intensely when we see what St. Paul teaches in Ephesians chapter 5, by which he raises the sacrament, the marriage covenant, into the level of a sacrament. What St. Paul tells us is that the relationship between a man and a woman can be likened to the relationship between Christ and his church. Now, if Christ will never divorce his church no matter what, then you know that God does not expect that a man should divorce his wife, because it is a covenant, and God is always faithful to his covenant and expects us also to be faithful to our covenant. It is in the same vein that God asked Hosea to marry a prostitute, that whenever the prostitute goes out, they should go and look for the prostitute Hosea in order to reveal that relationship between God and man. Now, I just want to read to you the definition of marriage. And this is what the CCC says. Marriage is a covenant by which a man and a woman establishes between themselves a partnership of their whole life, and is ordered by its very nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation of children, and it has been raised to the standard of a sacrament. Two things. Marriage, the first purpose of marriage is the good of the spouses. The second is for procreation of children. Now, this should tell you that the main aim of marriage is for the good of the spouses, so that even without children, when children are not possible in marriage, marriage is still holy and sacramental. And that is why it becomes very unfortunate when Christians put pressure on marriages and on Christian marriages because they want them to give birth. That is a second purpose of marriage. Let us remember that the Christian marriage is holy. It's a covenant between God, between the two partners, and he expects us to respect that covenant and to understand that Christian marriage is up and above any other kind of marriage that we may have experienced on earth. May God bless you and have a good lunch. Peace be with you.
Radio Angelus, 24-hour online radio.